pleased to introduce Michael Owens for our next speaker. Michael Owens has been serving the Reformed and Mennonite communities from southeastern Pennsylvania since 1994. Michael Owens has been serving the Reformed and Mennonite communities from southeastern Pennsylvania since 1994. His calling is to make more music more available to more people. His editorial output includes the Cantus Christi 2020. It's a great resource. If you don't have a copy, you should get one. Okay. And I'll turn it over to Michael.
Peace and praise to all of you. It's good to be here. Thank you for letting me talk and listening. Before I begin, the stated conference topic here was what church musicians wish their church leaders knew. So far, no one has addressed that, so perhaps that'll be the subject for another year as well. I think it's a fruitful topic. I'm not qualified to speak on that topic, but I did want to say a sentence or two about what to me is a very pressing issue, what the average congregant wishes his music leaders knew. With some experience, I can, for myself and others I've talked to, I can say with all seriousness and sobriety and every possible emphasis, we are capable of learning and enjoying far more than you think we are. But it takes us far longer to learn it than it takes you. So that's the message I would pass on if I had a lecture on that theme. I've got a 60-second lecture on that theme. Give us more to sing, but give us more time to learn it. So yeah, I wish I could lecture on that, but I have another topic, and that is we need more and better metrical psalms. We have no complete, faithful English metrical psalter. We have no complete, faithful English metrical psalter. I was going to say, we have no complete, no faithful English metrical psalter that's also beautiful and vigorous, which is true. But I realized that if a psalm setting is not beautiful and vigorous, it's not faithful either. The aesthetics are inspired too, as has been pounded home to us in several lectures already. A paraphrase, metrical or otherwise, which gives us all the beauty and the vigor of a psalm, but doesn't give us all the concepts, is as inadequate as one that gives us all the concepts, but is ugly and boring and dead. So a psalter that's not beautiful is not a faithful psalter. We don't believe that only the concepts are inspired. The artistry is not dispensable. Now, we have a lot of settings with great beauty and vigor, and we have plenty with decent conceptual accuracy, and quite a number that are neither. But we have almost nothing with both. We have a huge number of options. I've collected over 5,500 metrical psalms and scriptural canticles, and there's almost nothing which is both beautiful and accurate. They're all deficient. We need more. We need better. Now, I've been saying that for years. Anybody who knows me knows that's one drum I like to beat. We need better and more and better and more metrical psalms. But today I want to demonstrate. I'm planning to overview those 5,500 metrical psalms from 60 or 65 different sources, which will give me about 30 seconds for each one, which is fine. This is just an overview. We can glance at, I don't know if you can see that. It doesn't matter if you can see it, because I'm obviously not going to read all the words on every slide. I just want to give you the idea of how I evaluate these. But before I do that, I should define what constitutes a metrical psalm. How do I decide what to include in this collection? Very simply, I'm looking for an intelligible English poem in regular meter, more than 50% recognizably based on a single scripture passage. So that would be the 150 psalms plus 50 or 60 non-psalm scripture canticles. So an intelligible English poem in regular meter that's recognizably from a scripture passage. Also, I should admit that if you read any of these settings that I'm referring to and you disagree with my evaluations, that's great. If you think my description is inaccurate, I have not read every stanza of all 5,500 selections, and I welcome anyone to do what I've done better than I've done it, more thoroughly and more accurately. It seems like it would be a fruitful topic for somebody's doctoral dissertation, actually, but if anyone's done it, I haven't found it, which is why I'm taking it on. Furthermore, this is not even complete, the pile that you see behind me, because I've forgotten a number, and there's a number that I haven't found yet. Collections I know are out there. If you know of any metrical psalms that I don't mention here today, please tell me about them. I am a collector. 717-572-2078. I don't want that necessarily in the YouTube description, but I'm happy to say it out loud for people who want to contact me, meo-525@juno.com. Also, I want, before I get started, many of these psalters have music. I'm only going to be commenting on the words. So how am I evaluating these? If you can see that, you can see what I'm going through. After the identifying marks on the top there, I am evaluating them by aesthetic faithfulness or beauty and conceptual faithfulness or accuracy. Now, like I said, I'll include it in my list if it's intelligible. But intelligible is a pretty low bar. I would like them to be a lot more than just intelligible. But I do mention intelligible up front in case anyone says, well, I can understand that. What's wrong with it? I acknowledge, yes, they are intelligible, usually. The problem with low-quality poetry is not that it's unintelligible. The problem is it's ugly. The problem is it's weak, it's boring, it's dead. Reading bad poetry is like, particularly a bad metrical psalm, is like driving down a road full of potholes. You know, you get there, it gets the job done, but it's miserable. Why would you do it? Other people have defended these standards. That's not my job. My job here is to apply them and show how they have been used. And of course, there's lots of other aspects of both beauty and accuracy that I could have included here. I just included a few of the most glaring ones. The big E on the eye chart. If it doesn't do this, it's a problem. The syllable and accent count, just quickly define some of these, refers to whether each stanza has the same number of syllables per line and if those syllables match the meter in every other stanza. Word padding or syllable padding refers to extra syllables that add no meaning. I often call this the foghorn leghorn effect. If you have a phrase that says all shall know and it expands out to then men will know throughout the earth, you haven't added any meaning, you've just added syllables. Word inversion is sometimes done for emphasis. It's a legit poetic device. And I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to words that are inverted just to fit the meter. And there's lots of examples of that. We all have our own favorites. This is what I call the Yoda poetry. And I would imitate it if I had a good Yoda voice. Does anyone in the room have a good Yoda voice? Some of these further on you'll be able to chuckle at. Aaron just talked about end-line rhymes. It is considered acceptable if only half the lines rhyme, but it's really ugly if they sometimes rhyme and sometimes don't within the same poem. A tone is mostly a matter of vocabulary. Some use rather lofty vocabulary, some more vernacular, some are rather childish, some are a confused combination thereof. Vigor refers to things, as Aaron was saying, like dead constructions, starting a phrase with there is or it is, versus lively constructions, passive voice versus active voice. Active voice is obviously going to be more vigorous. Abstractions versus concrete imagery, all the things that kill poetry. What I consider striking phrases are obviously just my opinion, though I think people who enjoy and like poetry would, I hope, would agree with me. But again, if you don't agree with me, do it yourself. I would love if someone else would do this. Archaisms, of course, are a matter of degree. It's not necessarily a criticism, but it is something to be noted as we pick out mild archaisms, such as old-fashioned pronouns and helping and linking verbs, thee, thou, dost, doth, art, and so forth, as well as old-fashioned words like boon, are perfectly intelligible, just a bit stiff. On the other hand, obsolete archaisms would be words that have dropped from use, like the word descry, descries, or white, W-I-G-H-T, comes up. C-I-E-L-D, I had to look that up, sealed. It just means sealinged. Or words that have changed drastically in meaning, like the word perch, or have changed pronunciation, like the word impious used to be pronounced impious. You need to reword it, because words like that are unintelligible and can be humorous. And so they need to be rewritten before they're used. And just for curiosity, I mentioned metrical variety and acrostics. As you can see, if you have really good eyes, 9 of the Psalms have acrostics, and sometimes the poets observe that. Conceptual faithfulness is mostly a matter of adding or removing concepts. When someone adds concepts or sermonizes, it may be something as little as an extra adjective. It may be an entire phrase. It may be either extrapolated from the biblical idea or completely imported, or completely invented. If the poet omits concepts or summarizes, again, it may be just a word or two. It may mean omitting whole phrases or whole verses because he's said, 10 lines worth of material in three phrases. This category does not include partial settings where only some verses were intended to be covered. If he says this is just verses 10 through 15, then I'm not going to say, well, he left out 1 through 9, because he didn't mean to include them. And the last 3 issues I consider to be touchstone issues for conceptual faithfulness. Scattered through the ages, some psalm metricizers use New Testament language, which is mainly the word Jesus, but a number of other words and concepts that would not have been present in the Psalms: Christ, church, devil, Satan, Holy Spirit, depending on how they're used. Sometimes the word Trinity shows up, or cross. Direct references to the Lord's Supper, baptism, substitutionary atonement, that sort of thing is a New Testament import. Some modern versions, as we all know, are squeamish about gender pronouns, either for God or for humans or for both. I noticed that people who use this gender-neutral language, they call it inclusive language, happen to be better than average poets. So the result is never awkward, and it's also not heretical, since what they end up saying is actually true. It's just not as faithful to the original. And lastly, they end up saying is actually true. It's just not as faithful to the original. And lastly, of course, the imprecations. Some people are a bit squeamish about cursing God's enemies or listening to God curse his enemies. So folks will omit them or weaken them, or they may leave them intact, or in some cases even expand them and maximize them. And then I have some comments and examples. I invite you on your own time to compare each of the examples against a prose translation of the passage listed. For now, we're just going to glance at each one of these. Originally, I had planned to assign a score to each of these points and calculate a total for each one. But I decided to let you determine how much you value each item if you're going to pick out a metrical psalm to use, and just give you the facts. So this is an informational lecture only. And I should emphasize, my opinion will peek through, as it already has, these descriptions, but I am trying to describe, not to evaluate, because many of the characteristics that I personally find objectionable were not mistakes. They were deliberate. And I should acknowledge again up front that I'm applying a standard to these metrical psalms that the metricizer, him or herself, didn't have. But as I say on YouTube, let's get into it. The first one is the Sidney Psalter. Philip Sidney, who did the first 42 and then died, and his sister Mary Sidney Herbert finished it out. Not published until recently, but it was circulated widely in manuscript for hundreds of years. John Donne, the poet John Donne, wrote a long poem in praise of the Sidney Psalter. It was nominally not intended for singing, but several of them are in the Genevan meters, and they've never been included in a hymnal until the Cantus 2020. They use many, many intricate poetic devices, which make, on a superficial reading or singing, it make it a bit obscure. Many of the meters they use currently have no tunes, and some of their archaisms have lost their meaning by now. The Ainsworth Psalter, Henry Ainsworth's Psalter, is also known as the Pilgrim Psalter, since it was the Psalter brought over to America by the Pilgrims. I only mention it because of its historical significance. It is ugly to the bone. Sternhold and Hopkins, number 3, called the old version, when the new version came out, called the whole book of Psalms. If historical impact is important to you, as it is for some people in picking out metrical psalms, this is your best choice. It is less ugly than its contemporaneous options. I don't have a hard copy, but it's all on hymnary.org. George Wither, again a known quantity in 17th century English English literature, wrote a complete Psalms of David, 150 Psalms plus 16 alternate versions of some of the Psalms, 16 of the Psalms. He's far more accurate than the Sidneys are, and his poetic artistry, to my reading, is just a bar or two lower. These come near to... Go ahead.
Is there a way that you could zoom in?
No, I'm really sorry. That's as big as it can be. The thing is, the reason I should have said this earlier, I have this up here to give the idea that these have all been evaluated. I don't actually intend to go through all the details here. If you want to see them, I can give you the PDF afterward or a printout, and also they'd be available on YouTube. I assume. These are being, thank you, Zach. Sorry. These are so archaic they're hard to recommend anymore, but for people who like archaisms, which some folks do, this volume is a real treat. Even in the Elizabethan era, great beauty could be combined with great accuracy. Then we have the Bay Psalm book, the lowest point of aesthetic faithfulness, so ugly it makes me long for the Scottish Psalter. And again, I only mention it because of its historical significance. This is the first book published in America, and it was produced because people thought that the Ainsworth Psalter I mentioned earlier added too many ideas. And then the Scottish Psalter, the most widely used metrical Psalter of all times. Has a reputation for being accurate and beautiful. I've heard it called the King James Bible turned into verse, but it's not. Empty extra syllables, ludicrous word order, obsolete pronunciations make this, to my way of thinking, almost useless. Finding ugly examples is like catching fish in a barrel. We all have our favorites. John Milton wrote 19 Psalms. This is the John Milton, not his father, who also wrote hymns and Psalms. The first 9 were not written for singing, and they need to be adapted to make them singable. Also, same with Psalm 136, which has shown up in a lot of hymnals, abbreviated. The complete version is in the Cantus 2020, but has been adapted. And even then, it's a bit peculiar. But the others are ready to use. By the way, I should mention this point. Turning the Psalms into English verse was apparently a popular pastime in those days because I've mentioned a few already, Wither and Milton, but I'm leaving out partial collections by a lot of other poets that you may have heard of if you're familiar with that time period. Francis Bacon wrote some, Robert Burns, Thomas Campion, I have a list here, Thomas Carew, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Davies, Anne Finch, Joseph Hall, George Herbert, Francis Quarrel, Thomas Stanley, Anne Steele, Henry Vaughan, Thomas Wyatt. They all have, I think those are all partial psalters. I think Withers is the only one that's complete. And the only reason I know about them is because of this book, the Poet's Book of Psalms, which is almost entirely drawn from that time period. Along with a few others that I've mentioned. It's the only way I even heard about some of the individuals on here. I haven't found the collections yet of the others. Okay, I don't have a copy of Tate and Brady, the new version of the Psalms of David. It's all available digitally. These guys add more concepts than the Sternhold and Hopkins. It was designed to replace the Sternhold and Hopkins, but it's much more sensible to read. They were deliberately trying to be classical, or Augustan. Augustan? Is that the right word? They're from the classical period of Caesar Augustus. Their paraphrase theory is similar to Watts's, but they stay much closer to the original than Isaac Watts does. I was actually surprised how much I enjoyed these. I didn't want to stop reading them. They're fun to go through. I was quite delighted and charmed to find that our very own Cotton Mather had written an entire metrical psalter called the Psalterium Americanum, covered all the Psalms and a bunch of the Canticles. I have not found a digital copy. This is a whatever they call this, a facsimile. One of many metrical psalters from New England between the Bay Psalm Book of 1640 and the War for Independence. It was, again, apparently a popular thing to do. I haven't found any others. Mather has far fewer flaws to aesthetic and offenses against aesthetic faithfulness than the Bay Psalm Book and so forth, but almost every line he has at least one syllable with the wrong accent. So it's, to my way of thinking, unsingable. Then we have Isaac Watts, who began a tradition of much freer and looser treatment of the Psalms, psalm-based hymns, though some of them are fairly strict, so he varies a good bit in his precision. By far the most widely popular collection of texts in this list. Many people know his psalm settings and don't even realize they are psalm settings. Several times he mentions Great Britain in his psalm settings, as well as the papist. He was trying to make it immediately applicable. All the idolaters mentioned in the book of Psalm turn out to be Roman Catholics. I was very charmed to discover Christopher Smart, Kit Smart, another one of those like William Cooper, who went mad and spent time in the asylum, but a really quite interesting poet. Excuse me. Of the literary psalms that I mentioned and that I've found, this is the most singable, and I call him literary because his poetry is worth comparing to the others, but he's not quite as packed with poetic subtleties. He's more likely to be compared, if you were to read him, with Watts, because they were both doing the same thing. They're both New Testamentizing, and they both are from the same time period. He's much more thorough than Watts, much more interesting. On the other hand, even though he's a half century more recent, he has a lot more obsolete pronunciations and words than Watts does. I do not have a hard copy of Francis Hopkinson's Psalms of David with the Ten Commandments in meter. It's all again at hymnary.org. Some of his are identical to, many are expanded from the new version, the Tate and Brady that I mentioned earlier. He adds words, but he's much more skillful at it than many other poets. They add meaning, but it makes the entire effect of the poem a bit heavy. Unlike Christopher Smart, his archaisms, which he certainly has some coming from the 1760s, rarely obscure the meaning. Then we have the New England Psalm book. Again, I don't have a hard copy of it, but it's all on hymnary. Despite needless word order inversion and lots of added words and syllables, it actually reads much more smoothly than more popular psalters that have the same drawbacks, like the Scottish. If you don't mind archaisms, this is the most accurate and most enjoyable complete psalter that I know of from before the 20th century. Not as enjoyable as Smart and some of the others, but more precise, more accurate. Next I have Joel Barlow. Barlow was commissioned to metricize all the Psalms that Watts omitted. Watts did, I think, all but 17 or 18 of the Psalms. And Barlow, a century later, in America, was commissioned to fill out those, as well as to rewrite all of Watts's Briticisms and anti-papist phrasings. I think he was a more skilled poet than Bartlett. He has very few archaisms. I have not been able to trace the source of the Evangelical Psalter, Psalms and Hymns of Reformed Worship. This volume must have been published after 1912 because it looks new and because it has selections from the Psalter 1912. Okay, I would love to know some more details on that. See me afterwards, Scott. There's no date in it, but the contents reflect 200 years of hymn writers imitating Watts. There's a lot of Watts in it, actually. Using a psalm as a jumping off point for making a hymn. Faithfulness to the original is not the goal. Most of them scarcely meet my definition of a metrical psalm. And it has a lot of hymns in it as well. Moving more recently, we have the Psalter 1887. This is the earliest volume that I own from this stream. But there were several others between 1866 and 1912. This one clearly owes a lot to the Scottish Psalter. While it has fewer obsolete words and pronunciations than the Scottish, it has even more needless words and an equal number of weak constructions and convoluted phrases. There's some examples there that you can read if you'd like a chuckle. The Psalter 1912 for a century has been the favorite metrical psalter for all the non-Scottish Reformed folks. It's been used in many hymnals. The Trinity hymnals are packed with quotes or selections from this book. Surprisingly inconsistent. faithfulness to the original is halfway between, as I write there, halfway between what Watts was doing and what the Scottish were trying to do. It's currently being revised. I just finished typesetting it. Just a heads up, if you're interested in buying the new edition, it doesn't have any new lyrics in it. It's all the original lyrics, unchanged, along with many other lyrics from other sources, pre-published sources, but there's not much new material. Then I have 4 or 5, well, I guess I have 3 here, psalters. So it became popular in the half century or so after the Psalter 1912 for each denomination to bring out their own psalter, which was mostly taken from the Psalter 1912. So I mentioned them there. No additions, no alterations, and so their evaluations are redundant on that. I should say that several of these Faith Alive Christian resources that Christian Reformed Church Publishing Arm holds copyright to, before you ask them permission, check and make sure that the setting you're looking for is not actually already in this 1912 Psalter, because that's public domain. The Union hymnal is not a Psalter. It's just a hymnal with some metrical psalms in it, which was not uncommon. Throw a bunch of metrical psalms in your hymnal. But in this case, where most hymnal editors just grab something from the Scottish or from Watts or from the Psalter 1912, the Jews here commissioned their own. So there's 20 in there that I haven't found elsewhere, and the style is a lot like Watts. And we have James Rossi Brown, the Murrayfield Psalter. My copy has the first 20 or so pages cut out. So I don't know a date or necessarily what his translation theory is, though I did find an interesting review of it online. This was intended, as best I can tell, to replace the Scottish Psalter. The body of the work, the 150, uses the same specs as the Scottish Psalter, just without the archaic pronunciations. It was not successful. I think maybe one of them appeared in Eric Routley's hymnal, but none of them have appeared elsewhere. The 21 alternate settings that he has in the back are far more beautiful than the body of the work, but they're not quite as precise and accurate. Now that's 20. The next 48 listings that I have, which account for 2/3 of all the extant English metrical psalms we have, are from the last 50 years. So there's our next slide, yes. Psalm praise is the first of a new wave of psalters, a wave which is still rising to this day. Appropriately, this year is the 50th anniversary of this book, Psalm Praise. From here on, nearly everything is copyright, although many of the copyright holders will allow use with no fee. During this new wave of metrical psalm writing, it was common to update older settings. I am generally going to skip those if I'm able to. I'm not interested in updating. I'm interested in newly composed material. I divide the next 3,000 or so psalms into mainline and conservative. The mainline settings are pretty heavily summarized and sermonized. All but one of them are good quality poetry, but they tend to disagree with God about gender and about imprecations. The conservative metrical psalms, about a dozen sources, curiously enough, are within or near to the CREC. None of those are complete yet, and none have visibility outside our denomination. But the CREC and friends have produced about 150 metrical psalms and canticles, although the quality varies a good bit. So yeah, back to this psalm praise. Most of these settings were composed for their own tunes and use peculiar meters which wouldn't fit any other tune. Some of them are, so you either have to use the tune that's provided or come up with, or invent another one. Some of these are very close to the ideal of beauty and accuracy, but most of them are quite paraphrased. You can see a list of the authors included. I listed the authors who are included who I'm not going to mention elsewhere, so I think Christopher Idle is in here as well and some others. Then we have the Book of Psalms for singing. Unless you're in the Scottish tradition, this is probably the first and maybe the only complete psalter that you know of. It's certainly the first one I ever heard of. And this is the flagship example of including all the concepts and completely missing the poetry. Many selections from this book are adapted from the Scottish or the Dutch Reformed versions. Many are from the RPCNA's own Book of Psalms with Music, 1929. Incidentally, if you're familiar with this book, the Trinity Psalter, you may know that there's nothing in here that's not already in Book of Psalms for singing, with the exception of, I think, Psalm 144. And we have a slim volume, Psalms for the Church Year, which is 14 total Watts style meditations in current language, some of them more accurate than others, some of them more beautiful than others. Then we have the Book of Praise, falsely called the Anglo-Genevan Psalter. The Anglo-Genevan Psalter was a collection of tunes made in England to imitate the Genevan Psalter. It's totally different from what's here, but it sounded like a clever title, I suppose. This is the first complete English language Psalter written for the Genevan tunes, 125 tunes for the 150 Psalms and 3 Canticles. 20 of these settings are from previous Christian Reformed Church Psalters. The writing here, as we saw in Aaron's lecture, is so expanded that it amounts to a miniature commentary. I find it, this is another version with the music, I find it compelling poetry. Competent poetry is the word I meant to use. It's just a bit heavy compared to reading the original, to reading a prose translation. The Psalter Hymnal 1987, the Christian Reformed Church went further than it had before in summarizing concepts. They did rather well poetically, except for some rather juvenile phrasings. I tend to avoid this, unless there's nothing else. I wanted to mention the Niagara Psalter, which is currently in process, not printed yet. My friend David Koises from Canada is, as we speak, constructing a complete metrical Psalter. His goal is to have all original lyrics, all original music, and interesting all syllabic music. He thinks that there's a drawback in using melismas in congregational tunes, so that'll be curious when it comes out. He tends to add more concepts than he removes, and this listing is separate from, he also did the complete Genevan Psalter, new lyrics for the Genevan Psalter, which I'll get to later. Sing the Psalms, Dale Schoening, by far the lowest quality published Psalter that I've ever seen. It looks like a first draft, frankly. The complete Book of Psalms for Singing by Roland Ward. 118 of these are original with Ward. Some of them are taken from other sources. Roland Ward is Australian. His poetry his psalm poetry has shown up in a number of other hymnals and psalm collections. To me, it looks like a second draft. His rhyming is inconsistent. The 75 original with this book don't rhyme, which is really distracting. Or I should say, they don't rhyme. They rhyme only accidentally, which is very distracting. The 42 that he did for the Australian Psalms of Singing 1983 all do rhyme. So we can do it. The Psalter Supplement number 1, I don't know that there was a number 2. I assume that this is from Crown and Covenant because it has their address in the front, but it has no date, no attributions, and no copyright information. Go figure. Pretty much all the same specs as all the rest of Crown and Covenant's work, except it doesn't have as many rhymes. Only 13 of them are original to this book. Then we have psalmistry, a very interesting little connection that I debated whether to include because they are so brief. What he does is take a few phrases from each psalm and rewords them with 1 to 3 stanzas and puts them to his own music. So it's more through composed than it is metrical. Every one has its own meter, and it barely makes my list. But I put it on here because I really enjoy the writing. I think his poetry is consistently skillful. It's intriguing. His paraphrasing is, of what he selects, is pretty faithful to the original, particularly in the touchstone issues, the New Testament language, the genders, and the imprecations. And his setting of Psalm 109, you can see there, has probably the only instance in all of metrical psalmody of the word damn. Then we have Carl Dahl Jr., who is a towering figure in the hymn explosion hymn writing movement. Splendid poetry, as you would expect from someone this skilled. Most of his psalm settings, most of them are in here, but not all of them. Others are scattered throughout various publications. Barely qualify as psalms because he adds and removes so many materials. The reason so much material. The reason I include it is because his settings are called psalms in a lot of hymnals. Then we have yours truly. I am not a psalm metricizer. This is not my calling. I'm an editor. But sometimes editing means rewriting stanzas or sometimes entire psalms. So I have a few of my own listed there. Valerie Bost, whose name I accidentally said is Boast last year. Sorry, Valerie. This is her calling. She's from Christ Church Moscow. She is getting closer to, as I see it, the ideal combination of beauty and accuracy, and I'd like to see her do more. Then we have Christopher Idle, who has shown up in some previous collections. Again, another well-known hymn explosion hymn writer. I'm calling these psalm-flavored devotional hymns. Every one of them is a delight to read, but none of them are very close to the original. And again, his show up in some other volumes here. Doug Wilson's output is very uneven. All of them need to be revised, some of them more than others. You can see why I think so if you read my evaluations there, but I won't spend a lot of time on it. He tells me that he intends to do the whole Psalter. We'll see how that goes. Michael Morgan's Psalter for Christian Worship is, again, in the same high-quality psalm-flavored devotional hymn category. The whole thing's in here, the whole Psalter, but a lot of concepts added and removed. My friend Mary Rose Jensen from Houston, Texas, as far as I can tell, is not related to any of these other streams. She's doing this on her own. Most of what she writes are adapted to tunes that she wrote with unique meters, so they can't be sung to any other tunes but hers. I enjoy reading these, though her vernacular is sometimes a bit juvenile in my opinion. Then we have Sing Psalms 2003. Even though this is Scottish, it has nothing in common with any previous Scottish Psalter. Thank the Lord. By far the highest quality and most accurate complete Psalter at this time, though it still leaves something to be desired since it's not as delightful to read as even a prose translation is. In my opinion, I would call this reliable but not stunning. And I think Psalms ought to be stunning. Martin, I think it's Leckbush, but it might not be, because I've never actually heard anyone pronounce it. Once again, 150 more high-quality psalm-flavored devotional hymns. I would call this among the best poetry of all the complete Psalters. It's a shame that it's so summarized. Some of these individuals, I think, could do a fantastic job if they tried to be thorough and accurate. I was really delighted to see the Elbe Psalter, I believe is how you pronounce it. Again, I've never heard it said out loud. From the Elbe Fellowship up in New England, T.M. Moore. His are complete except for the 10 or 12 longest psalms. He'll just do selections from them. The last I heard, the Elbe Psalter is under revision. Occasionally, his syllable count is incorrect because he was writing with a tune in mind, and at that spot the tune has a melisma, so in some cases he has just one syllable, and other cases he has two syllables because of the melisma. So some of them will need to be adapted if you're going to sing them with any other tune. I'm going to mention the Upper Room Worship Book. Although it's not a Psalter, it does have 16 metrical psalms that I haven't found anywhere else. As best I can tell, not associated with any denomination, though if anyone else knows more about it, they can tell me. I couldn't tell by reading it who it was for, even. The National Council of the Churches of Christ doesn't tell me much. Most of the psalms in here are not metrical. They are what's called responsorial settings, which is either a narration with a refrain or a chant and a refrain. And most of the metrical ones are in meters that would only work for one tune. Some of them are less than 50% recognizable as a psalm. Most of them are from John Bell and the Iona community, which I believe is in Scotland. Can anyone speak to that? John Bell. Our friend Brian Penny, I believe a CREC minister in Long Island, New York, has done quite a number over a 5-year period there, a 6-year period. His are hard to evaluate. They're out there. They're free on the internet. They're hard to evaluate because they're so inconsistent. I couldn't, in any of these categories, come up with a word that described all of his settings. Some of them I find to be carefully crafted. Others need a lot more polish. Chris Weber's Psalter, based on some sort of lectionary. He doesn't do the whole thing. He's been used in a lot of hymnals recently. Other than his gender alterations, he's surprisingly faithful to the original compared to the other mainliners. The only weakness I see in his poetry is that he uses passive voice too often. Curiously enough, the description that I have listed there only applies to his 114 psalms. The 19 canticles, or scripture songs that he does, don't use gender-neutral language, and they do use archaic pronouns. So I'm not sure what was happening there. Some of them are included in this volume. I only brought this along because I have it. Most of them are not in here. Then we have the People's Psalter by Hal Hobson, which has 125 psalms, most of them in the responsorial style, the chant refrain style. The metrical texts in here are mostly by Michael Morgan or the Psalter 1912, but 8 of them are from the composer, Hal Hobson. And you can see my evals there. The Book of Psalms for Worship, a significant upgrade to Crown and Covenant's metrical psalm heritage. I would say many of them have been revised from previous Crown and Covenant work. Many of them have been repeated unchanged, and many of them are new to this book. I would say, as you see there, faithful, comprehensible, and dull. My friend Aaron in the car yesterday said harmless. Mostly harmless. Then we have the New Genevan Psalter. William Helder updated the 1984 Book of Praise to remove all the archaic language, which he does. He does that sufficiently, and he made a number of other changes as well. But it ends up with the same specifications as the 1984. There's still a miniature commentary on each psalm, and the writing is competent but heavy. And then we have my brother. He won't say it, but I will. As of this writing, the ideal of both beauty and accuracy. No one does it better. And God willing, he will write 1,000 more. I'm very fond of the music of Nathan Clark George and Greg Wilbur and their colleague Henry Hafner. For a while, they were all in Franklin, Tennessee. Musicians who regularly use other people's psalm and hymn texts, but sometimes write their own. I would just say that music writing is definitely their gift. Lyric writing is not. They are hoping to make a complete Psalter one day. By the way, not everything that they've done is included in here. Again, I just brought this because I happen to have it. This has all the ones that I had by 2018, but they're still writing. I mentioned Greg Strawbridge only because some people in the audience may have heard of his settings. If you read any of his settings and find that they don't match the description that I've given here, know that they were extensively rewritten. By the way, I should mention these ratings only apply to Greg Strawbridge's work. His daughter wrote a portion of Psalm 104, which I find rates well in every category, and perhaps she'll do more. I hope she does. Timeless is to be a 3-volume set. We've gotten through Psalm 89 so far, 2011 and 2016 respectively. All new texts set to all new tunes, most of them in unique meters, most of them have refrains. So that, again, faithfulness to the original is not a goal. 2 to 5 settings per psalm. The paraphrase standards vary somewhat, but mostly they omit more than they add. At least that's what I've found. I'll give a more complete eval when they come out with the last volume. Psalms for All Seasons, that Jim Jordan said he was vastly disappointed with, contains mostly chant and these so-called responsorial settings, and some brief through-composed portions of psalms. The metrical psalms are so heavily paraphrased they scarcely make my definition. The metrical psalms overlap with other psalm collections. I think that I counted through all the ones that are only in this volume and came up with 109. Could be wrong. Probably the most delightful, the one that I will go to first if I just want some fun poetry to read. Brian Wren, he only did 14 of them, and he started his career evidently by imitating Watts. And some of the ones in here owe a lot to Watts, and I'm not including them in my count, but just the ones that were original to Wren. In most respects, his writing is like any of the other mainline hymnizers. I'm not sure why no one includes his settings in any other hymnals or collections. I think they're delightful. Sing to the Lord from the New Zealand Reformed Church. Mostly draws from Sing Psalms 2003 from Scotland and from Roland Ward's work in Australia. 16 of them are original to this book, but they resemble the other two sources that I just mentioned. Christian Lightheart has written 3, and he needs to do more. Why would I mention a source that only has 3 selections? Because they're excellent and we need more of them. Singing God's Psalms, I think he wrote in the introduction that he intends to complete. He's only done 116. He intends to complete them, but in private correspondence he said he's not going to. So we'll see what happens. I have to read a little bit from his introduction because I thought it was curious the way he phrased it. He always intended to write gender-neutral language for the human family, he says, but I took on the goal of using no masculine pronouns for God in an attempt to see if poetry might be written within that guideline while still maintaining theological integrity as well as aesthetic appeal. And I think he succeeded, although the poetry could use a little more polish in my regard, and he again adds more concepts than he removes. He's an expander. With a heavy heart, I must bring up a metrical psalter by Julie and Timothy Tennant. This is free online at seedbed.com, so I sometimes call it the Seedbed Psalter. And I've been dreading this moment since I first conceived of this lecture because their poetry is exquisite in all respects. It's accurate, it's beautiful, it's the ideal. But every single stanza has at least one syllable with the wrong emphasis. And reading it is like having gravel scattered through your ice cream. Every one of them needs to be repaired. I can't use a single one. Also, some other people have noted that their poetry tends to use enjambment, where one line doesn't end with the phrase but continues through, which is fine. That's one thing that poets are allowed to do if they know what they're doing. But it limits which tunes will work with their poetry. Again, Jordan Doolittle has only done 2. But they're really perfect in every way, other than I think he could add rhymes to it if he intended to. I would love to see more from you, Jordan, although I know that's not your calling either. As of 2017, the Psalter of Lakewood Presbyterian Church in Dallas contained mostly selections from the Psalter 1871 and the Book of Praise, but the pastor, Arnie Robertstad, did a few of his own. He's currently revising this with his colleague Chris Coldwell, and they're calling it the Naphtali Psalter. So he's up to 37 psalms, it looks like. I'll just say a word about this. There's three strategies for expanding a phrase if you need it to take up more space. You can either add synonymous words or words that are longer, or phrases that take up more space, or you can remove concepts or add concepts if you need to fit it in. But Arnie achieves the meter and the rhythm that he needs mostly by adding word filler and rearranging words from existing prose translation, which many psalters do adopt just that strategy. He's just better at it than most of them. Very charmed to see the Psalms for a Common Era by Adam Carlyle, a British vicar. I think he pulled this volume together in about 2 years. In his introduction, he says he omits nothing, but what that means is he makes no partial psalms. He certainly does omit some concepts. He has a lot of striking phrases. This is fun to read, but some of his phrases, as you can see there, are just a bit odd. This is another one that I read for pleasure. I find it charming, though I have to say, if I have, what kind of time do I have?
You're over time.
Oh, shoot. Let me at least read. I have not made it my business about he puts all the imprecations in brackets. I have not made it my business to decide which portions of Psalms are palatable, but in worship, some verses will need to be omitted. That depends. Gosh. Okay, I got 3 more. The Trinity Psalter Hymnal, Conscious Imitation of Songs, Sing Psalms 2003, Sing Psalms 2003, not quite as strong poetically. I skipped that one, didn't I? Ken Bible, I don't know what LNW hymn stands for. I am going to have to skip some of this if we're going to end promptly. I would really rather sing than talk. Jubilate, I should mention because it's widely popular. Jubilate is not a hymnal or psalter. It's an online collection of hymns and psalm paraphrases by many authors. And I put them last only because I have no date. They've been going since the 60s. And then several of their more prolific authors have their own pages here. David Preston, who seems to be the most conservative. Emma Turrell, who uses a lot more New Testament language. David Mowbray, and Timothy Dudley Smith, who's a hymn writer on his own. The last thing. If you want any of these settings, some of them are free on the internet. Most of the best ones are not. I'm hoping to make them all available to individuals for the asking. With the help of some friends, Lord willing, they should all be, 5,000 of them or so should all be available in a single text document. Obviously, the copyrighted ones you can't use without permission, but contact me if you want to look at any of these settings. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention that Braden's going to make sure that the PDF that Michael is drawing from here is going to be linked on the Church of the Redeemer YouTube channel in the description of this talk. And the talk was recording the screen as well. So
Good.
you can re-listen to the description, Michael's evaluation, and look at the notes as well.
And again, feel free to email me or call me because I will be filling this out and adding more.